Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks. We are doing a lesson today on the rise of organized labor. Now, organized labor is essentially a fancy word for unions, kind of. So our objective is that students will be able to respond to this prompt and do work after this presentation. Now, the prompt is, in today's society, should the United States government maintain and continue to pass legislation that strengthens the influence and power of organized labor? Now, that's a fancy way of basically saying, what should the role of unions be? Should unions be strong in our society today, or should they be weakened? Now, that's a difficult question to answer without really knowing the history of unions. So it's a long story, but that's what we're doing right now. Now, go back to the 1700s, and the world was generally happy. Obviously, complications. Most members of the world were involved in agriculture, kind of farmers, but that is going to change. And that change is going to be relevant to our story. So that change, two major causes. Now, last year, you should have studied the enclosure movement. Basically, the world was divided up into tiny little farms, and slowly powerful farms started to consolidate and take over other farms till pretty much we had massive farms and less individual farmers. Now, when that happened, the world needed less farmers because when those farms got taken over, they fired or got rid of a lot of their workers. Now, another major reason for this change is there was massive change in agricultural technology. And a lot of that technology basically replaced what the farmers were doing. So now we needed even less farmers. Now, where do those farmers go now that they're not needed because of the enclosure movement or technology changes? They went to the cities so they wouldn't starve, hoping that they could find jobs in the cities. Now, this is going to be because of, but also a cause of the Industrial Revolution. Now, there's a problem with this change. Now, that problem is that now that there were so many farmers, so many workers living in cities looking for jobs, that supply and demand is going to be a problem. Because there's such a high supply of workers, that means the demand goes down, since supply and demand are inversely connected. Now, if you have less of a demand for workers, their value goes down. And that's going to create an unprecedented power shift in the society. Because there were so many workers, management, factories didn't need them. And therefore, because there were so many unemployed workers, you couldn't really stand up as a worker to management. Because if you said you wanted to be treated fairly, they could just hire somebody that was unemployed, waiting outside for a job. So suddenly a power shift. Workers were not valued and therefore exploited. So again, this power imbalance is not going to be a good thing for labor when it comes to the relationship with factory owners and management. Resulting problems, wages are going to be driven way down. You want to complain about it? Hey, you're fired. I'll go hire somebody else. Massive poverty because of those low wages. Entire extended families all living in one room or tenement. Now, of course, with no money for health. People lived in unhealthy situations. So another aspect, employers could have you do whatever they wanted. So many people worked 10, 12, 14 hours a day. And of course, and that's kind of a sad situation. You would wake up in the morning, it would be dark out. And then you'd get out of work and it would be dark again. The sun came and went. Kind of a dismal way to live your life. Hey, at least you have the weekend, except you don't. Employers would say you're working every day, including Saturday. Quite often Sundays you did have off, but not Saturday. So you'd also have to work Saturday. Now after that, you would need a vacation to recover. Maybe spend some time with a family. There was no paid vacation at the time. Why would they pay you to go on vacation? So because you weren't paid, you didn't take vacation. Your whole life was really work with minimal time off. Often employers could just speed up production, tell you to do a lot more with the same or less time. Now, of course, a little unfair, but that would lead to injuries and rushing and shortcuts being taken. Here we have a few pictures of just a few of the many that would be wounded for the rest of their lives. Working conditions were horrible. Children were needed at this point. With the new technology, they need people with small hands, small bodies to get into the machines to fix them, unclog them. So child labor is going to be heavily utilized. And of course, that's going to lead to many problems. Now, often some fathers would say they wouldn't even get hired because employers would only hire you if you were going to bring your son or daughter along because they needed a son or daughter. So Factory workers at this point, across the world, were not happy. They were abused. Total imbalance of power changed society as we know it. Now, this lack of power and this abuse led to people basically saying, workers saying, hey, we are doing most of the work. Why do we have such a small share of the wealth that we ourselves are creating? What can workers do to address this, to try to make a change? How can workers get a more equitable power share? And workers thought about it, and the natural conclusion was to form unions, to establish unions. Now, the point is that as individuals, we have very little power. If, as an individual, I walk into my boss's room, I say, I want a raise, he can be like, you're fired. There's nothing I can do. However, if we work together, if 500 of us walk into our boss's office and say, we deserve a raise, now we have some power through solidarity. So the growth of unions at this time is going to become exponential. In the late 1700s, the world kind of began to have unions popping up. Now that was in part because of the Industrial Revolution of Europe and Britain. Once you had these factories, people started getting exploited, workers got treated terribly. That spurned this desire to create unions. Now in the United States, it would happen a little bit later because unions got established later because the United States Industrial Revolution kind of was spurned on after the Civil War. That said, during this period of time, these unions that came about were small, local. They were isolated from each other. They didn't have a lot of power. It wasn't really until the 1860s, 70s, 80s worldwide that national unions got created that linked across industries and across labor groups and across towns and states. And that's when the union movement's really going to exponentially gain some power and momentum. Now, priorities of the unions were, of course, recognition, asking for businesses and management to listen to them so that unions could bargain collectively. It's called collective bargaining because, again, if I ask for a raise, I have no power. But if all of us bargain together, 800 workers, now we have power. So that would be a priority of unions, to get recognized so that all negotiation happens with them, not with individuals. That's called collective bargaining. Another priority of unions during this period of time was the 8-hour workday. No more 14-hour days. That's just not fair. Dangerous working conditions. Such a dangerous time. Definitely a priority. Wages will always, and certainly was then, a priority as well. Tactics of unions to create these positive changes, to go after those objectives. The most popular tactic was a boycott. Let's get our 700 workers and all agree not to buy our company's products. That's going to hurt them in the purse, basically take money away from them, and that's how we can get them to agree to our desires, to our requests, our proposals. Collective bargaining, of course, if unions come together, their tactic is to negotiate together, as they can't turn us all down. If all 800 of us demand a raise, they have to do something. But of course, if collective bargaining doesn't succeed, the threat of going on strike. Now, why is going on strike effective? Well, a strike is when a union or an organized labor all agree not to work at the same time. If they all walk out, that business loses money. They don't make any money. That's why a strike is so effective. It's a little risky, though, because those workers lived paycheck to paycheck. They needed that money for food. If you walk out, you don't get paid. You might even get fired. So for an entire group to do that takes a lot of bravery. Now, of course, that was the point. They can fire a couple of us, but if we all walk off, all 800 of us, they can't fire us all. They need us. So that's where the power and leverage was. Now, while you go on strike, you picket. I guess you're not working, so you have time to do it. You're picketing. Part of picketing is to hold signs to raise public awareness of all the wrong that business is doing, to create public pressure on them to give you what you want. There is another purpose to picketing. Basically, that business is going to try to break your strike. While you're out not getting paid, they still want to make money. So they'll hire unemployed people called strike breakers or replacement workers or scabs to go in and work while you're on strike. That way the business is still making some money while you're not getting paid at all. Their hope is eventually you won't have any money and you'll just come back to work. This will keep them through this rough time. So part of what unions do when they're on strike is they do picket. And when they picket, they basically cover all the entrances to the building. And this prevents scabs, or those strike breakers, from getting in there because you look like a very intimidating group. Now, of course, you have no right to obstruct them, and naturally this can lead to violence. those scabs are perceived to be threatening your job, hurting the strike effort. So a lot of times those strike picketers are basically will attack the scabs. This violence has often led to that company bringing in their own private police force to protect those scabs, or even the regular police coming in. And when they come in, they often would basically fight with those union members, and that's going to lead to even more violence and often some deaths. Now, anti-union tactics that often happen by management and businesses include blacklists. Hey, if you try to form a union or join a union, I'm going to fire you, and then tell every other business that you are a troublemaker and they won't hire you. So not only will you lose your job, you'll never be able to get another job again. It's called a blacklist, and it's entirely illegal today. Yellow dog contracts. Businesses, when they hire you, will have you sign an agreement never to join a union or you will be fired. Those are also illegal today. Lockouts. If the union gets too powerful that exists, fine, we're just going to lock you out, not let you work until you become more reasonable, till you agree to lower salaries. So that's kind of like the opposite of a strike. That's what the businesses do. So strike. Another aspect of what businesses will do if you go on strike, we're going to hire the unemployed to come in and take your jobs. And of course, that's what when unions will picket to try to prevent that. Another thing that businesses and management will rely on is court injunctions. Often the government at the time was very sympathetic towards businesses. Businesses produce products, they create jobs, they help the economy. The people that own businesses have money and are powerful, and they know the people in government. So often courts will issue injunctions or court orders for strikes to be shut down. This is often used with the justification that those people that are striking are basically trespassing on their company's land. Now that they're not working, they're not allowed to be there, in theory, or they're blocking traffic. And so that's the ways that businesses and managements would push back on unions. Now, there was a huge watershed moment that's going to have much of the world decide their opinion. Do they support management, businesses, or unions? And this moment is going to be called the Haymarket Square Riot. In 1886, on May 1st, in the city of Chicago, at the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, there's going to be a strike. There's actually going to be thousands of strikes that day. Unions across the country all wanted to have a strike at the same time to protest and try to get the 8-hour workday. Now, those striking unions attacked the scabs that were brought in on May 3rd, 3 days of striking. Now, when they attacked the scabs, the police came in, and to protect the scabs, started firing on the union workers. 2 to 6 union members were shot and killed. This angered the union. This angered the anarchists in the city. And they decided the next day to protest the police killing and the lack of the 8-hour workday, the police violence upon them. This was called they called this protest to happen that night at Haymarket Square. This is going to be known as the Haymarket Square Riot. So many speeches were given against the police and their violence and against capitalism and management. But at the end of these speeches, towards the end, around 10:30, they started to get a little more violent and more calls of action to have violence to create change. So the police showed up in force and yelled, "I command you in the name of the law to desist and to stop speaking and to disperse. Get out of here now." And a bomb was thrown at the police as they rushed towards the group to break up the gathering. Suddenly, gunshots came out from the police towards the protesters there. Gunshots came back from the protesters, and a lot of people were hurt. 7 police were killed. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the Chicago police. 4+ union workers were killed, and so many more were injured. So the public perception was to support the police, that it was anarchists, foreigners, immigrants that were leading this charge, advocating for this violence. Anti-union sentiment, anti-anarchist sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment was trumped up from this. Now, the point of view of the police and much of the public was that this was a conspiracy. This wasn't just one person throwing a bomb. This was a huge group of anarchist union leaders that conspired together to throw this bomb, to kill the police and all of these public people watching. So 8 were arrested, even some that weren't even at the Haymarket Square protest. And ultimately, the trial was very complicated, but they were convicted. 4 were executed. 1 committed suicide in prison. And the legacy of the Haymarket Square riot was that this will serve to motivate the labor movement. People are going to see these people that were executed and all the victims of the protests as martyrs, people that died for the cause of fighting against the establishment, fighting against these businesses, fighting against capitalism, that workers are underappreciated in society, and it's going to mobilize that movement, energize it, and so much of the world is going to consciously then embrace fighting for labor. Now, one small piece of evidence is the establishment short thereafter of May Day. May Day on May 1st is celebrated even today around the world to celebrate laborers, workers, and their parades. And again, those are the days where people mobilize to create positive change for worker rights. Now, in the United States, we don't actually celebrate May Day because it had somewhat of a socialist reputation at the time. The United States wasn't so positive thinking of socialism that the United States established Labor Day and placed it around the other side of the calendar in September as a way to say we're going to protect and support workers, but we're going to call it a different day. And that's and on this day, this holiday tends to serve as people fighting for people that work, laborers. Now, that holiday, and of course the Haymarket Square riot, and all of this all of this momentum has led to a greater appreciation of workers and unions. And as you trace the percentage of citizens in the United States that joined labor unions as the 1900s went on, it's going to exponentially rise. It's going to peak in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way up to the 80s. And all of that support for labor unions and organized labor is going to lead to a massive amount of positive changes to protect workers that exist today, that we can count on today. And that leads us to our prompt. So our prompt is, in today's society, should the United States government maintain and continue to pass laws and legislation to strengthen the influence and power of organized labor, to strengthen unions? So I've provided about 12 links, asking you to do research and to gather the both perspectives to this question. So that prompt you can find in Google Classroom. Please answer the question, and good luck.